So, this first beast is a lion with eagle's wings. That would seem to suggest a strong and swift nation. One proof text would be 2 Samuel 1:23, which says, Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. We could go on to apply the other characteristics given by Scripture about lions and eagles, but I think the important part in terms of interpretation comes from the following lines. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. I think that both the wings being plucked off as well as the lion being forced to act like a man are to be understood as downgrades, or a bad thing for this kingdom, not an upgrade. The wings being plucked off is pretty obvious. If the kingdom was swift like an eagle, but its wings were plucked off, it would not be an advantage to that nation. The being given a man's heart should, in my opinion, be understood as having its lion's heart changed into a weaker heart. Scripture is clear that a lion's heart is better than a man's heart in regard to boldness or fearlessness. 2 Samuel 17:10 says, And even he who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt completely. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. Also, Proverbs 28:1 says, The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. So if I was looking for the fulfillment of this kingdom in the world, I would be looking for a kingdom who was strong and fast. But their fastness, their swiftness, was taken away from them somehow, and they were not as bold as they once were. Charles Cooper, in his paper on this subject, ties the Lion King here to the King of the South in Daniel chapter 11, which will attack the Antichrist in verse 40, but will pose no problem for the Antichrist, who will easily subdue him. It's not my goal in this study to provide the interpretation of which modern-day nations or coalition of nations are represented here. I'm not sure that we have seen the referent on the world scene yet, and more political maneuverings might be necessary before these verses can be applied to their modern-day geopolitical counterparts. I'm doing this study partly so that others will be able to make the connections when the time comes. I'm not saying that it is not worth looking for right now, but it's not obvious to me if the national reference can be known, though that could be because of my lack of information about geopolitics, or because the reference are not yet in view in the form being described here. But one thing I am sure of is that when it comes, it will be obvious if you're looking for it, and we don't have to look for cryptic fulfillments of these prophecies. If you have the right interpretation, it will click, and if you don't, it won't. The next beast is described in Daniel 7:5. It says, And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. The next beast Daniel describes is like a bear. In the traditional view, this must be Medo-Persia, because again, they believe that this is a retelling of Daniel 2, in which the second part of that statue is indeed Medo-Persia. As we've already noted, none of the ideas they apply to the lion work for the bear. There is nothing to indicate any Medo-Persian king had a humbling experience which made them to think like a beast, nor is there any indication whatsoever that the Medo-Persian Empire identified itself symbolically or any other way with a bear, and there is never a reference to any Medo-Persian king as a bear in Scripture. Proponents of the traditional view will say that the bear being raised up on one side is symbolic of the uneven relationship between the Medes and the Persians in their coalition. The Medes were initially the dominant party, but later the Persians were the more dominant of the two parts of the empire. It should be noted that the word raised up here is passive. That is, that it was raised up on one side by another force not of its own doing. Much like the lion having its wings plucked off and being stood up, etc., the bear is being raised up on one side by another party. Probably also the group that is ordering it to devour much flesh. It says, and they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. The they here could be a reference to the winds of the earth, that is the 4 winds, which stir up the sea in verse 1. The 3 ribs in the mouth of the bear, according to the traditional view, represent 3 notable conquests of the Medo-Persian Empire. But because there are more than 3 notable conquests of the Medo-Persian Empire in history, there's a lot of argument among those holding to this view as to which 3 conquests should be considered the most important. I, of course, don't think this has anything to do with the Medo-Persian Empire, and so we should not concern ourselves with why this is not a perfect description of the Medo-Persian military conquests. That is because it isn't. One interesting verse is found in Hosea 13, 7-8, in which God describes himself as all of the beasts in this chapter, and I think it will give us an idea of what these ribs are. It says, "So I will be to them like a lion, like a leopard by the road I will lurk. I will meet them like a bear deprived of her cubs. I will tear open their rib cage, and there I will devour them like a lion. The wild beast shall tear them." The bear here is described as tearing open a rib cage. And so I think the basic hermeneutic applied to the bear by the traditional view here is correct. That is, that the ribs represent initial conquests by this kingdom that are 3 in number. I would also note that almost every time a bear is figured in Scripture, the idea of it being, as it says here, deprived of her cubs is mentioned. That is, the biblical bear is most ferocious when its offspring is threatened. This is such a consistent thing that I would be surprised if the nation or nations that the bear represents is not acting out of a real or perceived sense of defense. It says, "Arise, devour much flesh." I think that this phrase is very important, as it helps to weaken the case that this beast represents Medo-Persia, because after the conquests of Cyrus the Great and his son Cambyses II, which occurred relatively quickly and very early in the Medo-Persian history, there would be 200 years of no conquering at all, until the empire was eventually defeated by Alexander the Great. The empire would spend most of its existence simply struggling to maintain the lands that were initially conquered for it by Cyrus and his son in the first few years. So if this bear, already with its main conquests in its mouth, is supposed to be Medo-Persia, then it either chose not to go and devour any more flesh, as it was ordered to, or it is simply not talking about the Medo-Persian Empire. I hope you understand what I mean by that. If it already has the conquest of Cyrus and his son in its mouth, then its future can't be looked at as devouring more flesh because it simply didn't in history. Charles Cooper connects the bear king to the king of the north in Daniel 11, who is said to try to make war with the Antichrist. It says in Daniel 11:40b, "And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he," that is the Antichrist, "shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through." In the past, people have tried to make the king of the north in Daniel 11 be Russia. This was due more to Russia being the current geopolitical boogeyman at the time that Hal Lindsey wrote his books, than to any reason from the text. Dr. J. Paul Tanner, professor of Hebrew and Old Testament studies at the Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary, wrote a paper called "Daniel's King of the North, Do We Owe Russia an Apology?" He concludes, quote, "To be hermeneutically consistent, the King of the North ought to be interpreted in light of the meaning the phrase has had throughout the chapter." Tanner has a very logical argument, and I would highly recommend his paper to anyone. He ultimately concludes this way, quote, "I would like to submit that the King of the North is a confederation of northern Arab nations that will attack the Antichrist and his forces in this military conflict centered in the Middle East." So, like the lion, I'm not prepared to suggest to you the specific nations that are represented by the bear, but I think it's highly likely that to go looking for it in the current climate would be a fruitless endeavor, as I believe these coalitions will arise quickly and possibly as a result of factors that have not yet occurred or are only beginning to occur. That being said, I would not let that keep any of you from being watchmen in this regard. Moving on to the next verse and next beast, it says, "After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." The leopard, with 4 bird wings and 4 heads, is the Greek Empire in the traditional view. Again, it has the same problem as the bear did, as Alexander the Great was not humbled by having his mind turned into a beast's mind, nor is the symbol of a leopard associated with the Greek Empire in any way, nor is Alexander the Great or Greece referred to as a leopard in the Bible. I would agree with the traditional proponents, however, that the 4 wings on the leopard's back probably represent a very fast-moving nation. One of the biggest problems with this view is the four heads of the beast. The traditional proponents say that the heads represent the four generals who Alexander the Great gave his empire to after he died. But even a casual student of history knows that the Greek Empire did nothing but diminish, and diminish greatly after Alexander the Great died. The traditional view then has Scripture attributing the fast and ferocious conquest of the Grecian Empire to the four generals. No mention of Alexander is present. This is problematic to say the least. Even if you were to assume that Alexander was somehow involved, perhaps he was the torso, to give so much prominence to the generals is completely inconsistent with history and the way that Scripture uses the head kingdoms motif. Charles Cooper makes the case that the leopard is speaking of the king of the east, or the source of the news from the east that will trouble the Antichrist in Daniel 11:44, but who it appears the Antichrist will also subdue. It says, "But news from the east and the north shall trouble him, therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many." So how does Scripture describe leopards? Well, they tear into pieces in Jeremiah 5:6. They're swift in Habakkuk 1:8. But I think the most prominent characteristic of leopards given by Scripture is that they lie in wait for their prey, like in Jeremiah 5:6 and Hosea 13:7. Leopards, like all cats, need to be very stealthy because although they're fast, they only have so much endurance with their running. So they need to watch and observe their prey in a very stealthy way and wait for the most appropriate time to strike. I think what we're looking for in the interpretation of this beast is an exceedingly fast coalition of four kings or kingdoms, or even four leaders of the same kingdom. And it may make an agreement with the king of the north. And because of the consistent use in Scripture, I think that this kingdom will have some quality which can be described as lying in wait or being patient before striking. The leopard is found only about 6 times in Scripture, and the only time it seems to apply to any nation or king is in Revelation 13 and here in Daniel 7. In Revelation 13, we see that all four beasts have been combined as they rise out of the sea for the final 3.5 years of the Antichrist's rule, suggesting again that we are to understand that these kingdoms in Daniel 7 are somehow being represented again all the way in Revelation 13. Moving on to the last beast. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Here the traditional view has Rome in view. All of the reasons for this are very general and can be applied to any of the previous kingdoms. That is, things like strength, being fearful because of its might. I think that any and every world empire would be able to claim those characteristics. The idea that it was different from the previous kingdoms also could be applied to any kingdom on that list, depending on how you defined different. There are major differences in the fourth empire described here in Daniel 7, and the last empire described in the statue vision back in Daniel 2. For instance, in this verse, the strength of this empire is clearly the main focus. Not a hint of weakness is detected. Contrast that with the last empire of Daniel 2, in which the Bible spends verse after verse telling us that that kingdom is divided and weak. I would call that a very big difference. The one in Daniel 2 is divided and weak, and the one in Daniel 7 is described as invincible. And again, to see more about Daniel 2 and the last kingdom in that chapter, please see the companion study to this. It should be linked in the notes, or you should be able to find it at the website versebyversebibleteaching.com or bibleprophecytalk.com. The main thing that people see as the clincher here is the reference to the 10 horns in Daniel 7, which they say correspond to the 10 toes in Daniel 2. But I beg the reader to realize that there is absolutely no mention of 10 toes in Daniel 2. That idea has to be read back into the text by people who assume that these two chapters are the same.